Hey, good morning, everybody. I'm Hot Rod Bob, and you've got gas, the morning edition. I'm glad you tuned in this morning. I hope you had a great weekend. We did too. We went on a couple of antivirus tours. Yeah, that's right. That's what I called them anyway. They were called COVID-19 cruises, and they were put on one by the Road Kings Car Club in Burbank, California, and had a small group of about 50, 60 cars. Yet, we went to the larger one that had hundreds of cars put on by the Coachman Car Club out in the Santa Clarita Valley, or actually, it was basically Thousand Oaks area. And it was a great day. Good morning, Danny Santos, Mike St. Angel, Jerry Wallace, Chuck Knoll. You were there with us at the Road Kings tour, and that was a good one. Phil Hoffman, Mr. NHRA, and Bobby Z. So we had a great Saturday of cruising. The Road Kings show or cruise started at 1 o'clock. And we went on and ended up at a Tasty Freeze for some cool refreshments, and that was good. We ended up going out to Thousand Oaks to start the Coachman Cruise. Now, the Coachman Cruise was so large, it took up the entire parking lot of a university. And then the cars escaped and went out across a prescribed path. Danny Santos says his grandson, Noah, said hi to Hot Rod Bob. Well, hi there, little Noah. How are you doing this morning? Cassie Nunez was part of both cruises with us, and she's watching right now. The car count, she says, was about 250 plus. I wouldn't doubt that. Jim Dillo, happy Monday to you guys, too. All right, what are we doing today? Well, today is May 4th. That's right. May the Ford be with you. That's right. Yes, there we go. A little play on words there. Ford Motor Company, one of two companies that are entirely owned by Americans. Well, I can't say entirely because they're shareholders, but two auto manufacturers that are based in the United States, started in the United States, and were owned primarily by Americans in the United States. They're American products. Now, they use import products. Every company does. But Ford was a pioneer. The quadricycle, the first Ford vehicle, came out in 1896. Now, it was a small little buggy powered by a single-cylinder engine, and Henry Ford had built the engine initially about 1890 on his kitchen table. I bet his wife was happy about that. Well, he did that and then expanded. And in the latter years, he formed a group of people. They liked what he was doing. Henry Ford joined a group of Detroit automobile companies that funds automobile companies in 1899. In 1901, Ford defeated the top race car driver of the era in his own car. Ford designed a 26 horsepower sweepstakes defended against Alexander Winton's 70 horsepower Bullet. Well, one of the things you got to do to win a race is you got to finish. And Alexander's car didn't finish. Ford went on and won that one. Good morning, Pete Moriello and Stephen. How are you doing this morning? Mark George. Mark, I've got the stuff for you. I'm going to get it out eventually. All right, 1903, the Ford Motor Company is incorporated. Now, it wasn't Henry Ford alone. He got with a group of people, and he spent $28,000 of his own money, but a total of, about $200,000 is what it took to form the Ford Motor Company back in the day. Good morning, Jess. How are you doing in Sweden? Good morning to you. And Corey Weaver. Now, there were 12 investors, 1,000 shares, and the company spent almost all of its $28,000 cash investment at one time. It sold the first Ford Model A because when Ford came out with his production, he started with the beginning of the alphabet. Good morning, Marlon Mitchell. You are a Ford guy for sure. Ron Stearns is watching us as well. So $28,000, first car, called the Model A, not to be confused with the Model A that we knew that came out in 1927 and stayed in production through 1930. But it was the first Ford production car sold to the masses called the Model A, July 1903. By October 1st, 1903, Ford Motor Company had turned a profit of $37,000. Now, that was a very tidy sum back in those days because, well, the average worker was making $2 a day. So think about it, $37,000 when you made $2 a day. How long would it take you to save that money? Good morning, Sid, Robert, and Larry. How are you this morning? So Ford Motor Company started out, and he had a little plant in what was called, well, now it's Windsor, it's Walkerville, Ontario. And that's right, he starts moving it to Canada. Ford, in 1904, builds his first plant outside the United States. That's how quickly Ford Motor Company was growing. So in 1904, Canada saw the first Ford manufacturing plant. All right, let's see. I'm getting a little bit of problems here with my computer as I go through things. 1903, 1904, 1907. Ford introduces its famous script, the Ford logo, as we know it. It wasn't anyone's signature. Clyde Harold Wills designed the Ford logo. He uses his grandfather's stencil set, his grandfather had, which was based on a style of writing taught in schools when Ford and Wills were children. All right, 1908, Ford introduces the now famous Model T. Yes, Mark, Dodge put the engines in, and actually Dodge brothers were building overflow vehicles for Ford. He couldn't keep up with demand. He hired the Dodge brothers, and they were manufacturers. They designed things, too, such as some of the chassis components, the engine transmissions, and so forth, that went into the Model T. So Ford was multi-qualified. I mean, you had the Dodge brothers working for Ford, and you had the Chevrolet brothers modifying Fords. That's right. To get a Ford to go fast, you needed the Dodge brothers and the Ford and the Chevrolet brothers. Yeah. Oh, gosh. I'm going to get some hate mail on that one. Hi, Murray DeWitt. How are you doing this morning? So Ford introduces the Model T in 1908, and it's an instant success and hit for the Ford Motor Company. Ford opens up its first overseas branch in Paris. That's right. Paris, Gay Paris, is Ford's first European endeavor. Ford introduces integrated moving assembly line. Now, a lot of people had an assembly line, but what they did is they pushed the vehicle to the next level. Ford created a moving conveyor system. He didn't invent it. He just took it and put it into place to manufacture cars. He went from producing 12,000 Model A's a year, or excuse me, Model T's a year, to 12,000 Model T's in 2 days. A big difference. Now, Ford kept on with his innovations and changes, became a world leader in auto manufacturing, and produced many vehicles in Europe as well as the U.S. and in Japan. They created a joint venture with Mazda, and then Volvo, and Jaguar, and the list will go on. And Ford even produced cars in Australia up until just a few years ago. Now they're more of an import company, and they import different vehicles from those joint ventures in other countries. Now, when you look at car companies here in the United States, and I know I said this earlier, there are 2 American, primarily owned manufacturers in the United States left. Chrysler, owned by Fiat. Jeep was part of Chrysler. Willys became Jeep, became Chrysler. American Motors, gone. Chrysler dissolved them. So the only manufacturers that started in the U.S. and stayed in the U.S. for the most part, General Motors and Ford Motor Company. Now, there are many cars built in the United States. Hyundai, Honda, Mazda, BMW, Mercedes. They all build cars here in the United States. Are they U.S. manufacturers? They're more of assembly plants, and the components come from many places overseas. Now, that's not to say that Ford and General Motors don't get their components from overseas manufacturers. Not the case. They definitely do. When I worked for one of those manufacturers, the body components for the trucks came from Brazil. The engines for one of the SUVs came from Australia. GM companies, GM Brazil, GM Australia produced the bodies and the engines. The vehicles were assembled here in the U.S. Now, did that make them a U.S. manufacturer? No, they were still an import to an extent. Now, did General Motors and does General Motors use import technology on their vehicles? You bet. The Duramax diesel. Oh no, I'm dispelling rumors. No, it's not a rumor. Duramax is 60% owned by General Motors and 40% owned by Isuzu. Isuzu designed the Duramax V8. Hi, Linda Kenyon. Good seeing you yesterday on the coronavirus cruise from the Coachman. Don Lister's watching now as well. Now let's see what else someone has to say. Mike St. Angel, do you think the Ford story on the Cars That Made America series was fairly accurate? For the most part, yes, I do. I don't remember the full story and that show too much because I watched so much stuff. But Ford Motor Company had a big influence on the United States. It had an influence on salaries, on income. In 1914, Ford doubled the daily rate paid to assembly line workers. It was $2.50. They doubled it to $5. And Henry was smart because at that point in time, he said, my employees should be able to afford my vehicles. And it did. A Model T sold for in the neighborhood, well, when they got the full production down, they were under $500 for a full brand new Model T. So you want your employees to drive them. You want your employees to own the product they build, to be proud of what they had. And they did, and it worked. All right, so let's take a look a little bit further. The Model A came out in 1927, late 1927, at the objection of Henry Ford. Now, he built 15 million Model Ts. He was happy. He figured everybody was happy owning a Model T. What more did you want than a Model T? And well, Edsel saw things a little bit differently. And after a lot of arguments with Henry and the bosses, so to speak, Edsel got part of his way, or most of it. The Model A was not a carryover vehicle. It was not a freshened up Model T. It was larger. It did not share any components from the Model T. It was a much better car. It had a better ignition system. It had better brakes. Model T used a band on the drive shaft. There were no front brakes on a Model T. Model A had four-wheel brakes. It had a regular 3-speed transmission. The Model T had a planetary. Now, a lot of people look at the Model T and see 3 pedals and go, okay, clutch, brake, gas. Wrong. The third pedal that you thought was a clutch was forward and reverse. Yeah, it's a planetary transmission, and the foot pedal is what engaged and disengaged the gears. So it was quite different from what you are used to today, and I'll be honest with you, most people today could not drive a Model T. They're just that difficult to drive. And at the time, that was all it was. Good morning, Don Lister, Neil Panks. William, how are you doing today? And Paul Summers, hey, dude. Denny Sanders is watching. Jessica Lundred. Jonas says hi. Hi, Jonas. You're watching in a different room as usual, right? Gotcha. Okay. So Model Ts, they are what solidified Ford's history in the United States. From the Model T came the Model A, then the Model B. Now, 1932, Ford came out with the first low-price car with a V8 engine. The full flathead V8 was amazing. Now, it was not called the Model B. The Model B was the 1932 Ford that had a 4-cylinder, not the V8. Yeah, look it up. Go ahead, check it. I'll wait. Okay, you got it? All right. So the Model B came out in 1932, and that is a 4-cylinder. The V8 cars are Model 18. One for the first 8-cylinder engine. Ford kept on producing cars, and they got so popular, even the famous robbers, Bonnie and Clyde, loved their Ford V8s. As a matter of fact, they loved it so much, they died with it. They outran everybody back in those days. Ford V8s were the most powerful, low-price car on the market. Chevrolet was the direct competitor, and they only had 6 cylinders, and they weren't as fast, but they were overhead valve. They were far more advanced than Henry. Now, Henry was very much a stickler for his engineering ideas. Oh, so Jessica says Jonas is working in the garage. You kicked him out of the house. Is that what it was? Anyway, Ford, when he first wanted the V8 designed, he didn't want it to have an oil pump. Engines didn't last very long. On the test bed, they just blew up. There was no V8 oil pump on the original design. Denny Santos, does Jay Leno have the original Model A's, and can he work the pedals? Well, the Model A is a standard transmission. That's probably not an issue. The Model T, I imagine he's got a Model T. I can't picture him without one, and he probably does know how. He is an extremely knowledgeable automotive historian, as well as his comedic talents and so forth, and his acting. You see him on Last Man Standing now as one of the regulars on the show. Yeah, Mike St. Angel, the tri-motor Ford aircrafts. I've seen them. As a matter of fact, I went back to Dearborn, went to the museum there at the Ford Motor Company headquarters. It was just down the street from the headquarters, and on the Fair Lane, the property that Henry lived on. And yeah, the tri-motors were amazing planes. Henry Ford got into tractors, planes, boats, anything that could be engine powered. Now, they compacted the company when those other businesses were not as profitable as the automotive business, and they concentrated on that. Henry Ford outlived his son Edsel. Edsel, as we know, passed away early on in his life from, I believe it was stomach cancer. Henry was in failing health, and in World War II, Henry Ford II was released from the military to keep the Ford Motor Company going. And he came in just before the war ended to take over the Ford Motor Company. And he was smart enough to know he wasn't smart enough to know. So he assembled a group of people, and they called them the Whiz Kids. And these guys took Ford Motor Company on and upward and changed the whole balance of the automotive industry. Now, Ford, because of Henry's influence and strong-fisted ideas, kept many technologies that others had abandoned long before. For example, Ford was the last one to keep a beam axle in place. They had them on the front of the vehicles through 1948, whereas most companies had gone to an independent front suspension with A-arms back in the 30s. But Henry, he stayed the course. He had a single buggy spring up front and a single buggy spring in the rear. And again, most companies had gone away from the single spring suspension systems back in the 30s, and in some cases, the 20s. But Henry kept it going. He kept the cost down. Now, Henry Ford II saw that the competition was going to be jumping out in front, and that's why he assembled the Whiz Kids and made such drastic changes to the Ford Motor Company, beginning with the 1949 model year. And the big shoebox Fords came out in that year, and they were revolutionary in comparison to what Henry had put out before that. Not to say anything against the old man, but Henry Ford II knew what he didn't know and put the right people in place to get things done. And Ford Motor Company soared once again. Now, they've all had downturns. Ford lost the sales lead to Chevrolet early on. And in 1957, they finally reclaimed it with the introduction of the 57 Ford. That was a very radical design change for Ford. The car was lower, it was longer, it was wider, it was more futuristic. The fins were there, and the car was very stylish. I've got one. I love it. It's great. It was my son's car. He drove it through high school. Denny Sanders says, you flew in a tri-motor about 17 years ago. You know, those things were pretty reliable vehicles or aircraft at the time. And the tri-motor, I saw one at the Ford Museum. They've got one inside there, and it's just an amazing looking vehicle. Again, can you imagine back in those days seeing something as radical as a Ford tri-motor? For me, it was the first time I saw a 747. Man, that was amazing. Well, that type of imagination, that type of excitement is what Ford brought with the tri-motor. Although many vehicles that Ford produced like that were not necessarily successes, they did bring attention to the company. And Ford Motor Company is still one of the largest automobile manufacturers in the world, producing cars in many countries. All right. They have joint ventures in many countries. They bring cars in from many countries. They no longer have the joint ventures with Jaguar, Volvo, and Mazda that they did at one point in time. But they are still a strong company. And how strong are they? They have been the only manufacturer, automobile manufacturer, based in the U.S., of U.S. origin, that did not take a reconstruction or stimulus package before. Chrysler and General Motors did. Ford did not. They restructured. They did what they needed to do to stay afloat without federal assistance. Could the others have done it? You betcha. General Motors could have done it. They didn't bother. They merely closed down and took the money, honey. Ford, they did it without federal assistance. All right, it's May 4th. Ford, the Ford May. The Ford of May. Yeah, may the Ford go forward. All right, folks, I'm Hot Rod Bob. You've got gas. Got a little information on Ford Motor Company. We'll talk about the other companies as we go along. Thanks for tuning in. Mike St. Angel, 57 hardtop convertible. Yeah, the flip tops. They were neat, and they were a nightmare. They were cable driven with some hydraulics, but a nightmare with micro switches. And that was one of the reasons it went away in 1959. Hi, Dar. How are you doing this morning? Rick Bauer and Danny Santos. You guys have a great day. I'm Hot Rod Bob. You've got gas, the morning edition, and you are a gasaholic if you're watching this. Thank you very much. Hey, don't forget the people that help bring gas to you every day. Valley Head Service, Irwindale Speedway, Irwindale Drag Strip, Service Tech with all your garage equipment needs, Moon Eyes, and more. You have a great day. I'm Hot Rod Bob, and you've got gas, the morning edition. Take care now, folks.